So hello students, we're back again to start our wonderful novel called Treasures of the Snow. You might be interested in reading through and having a look at these during reading questions and activities page, which you will find about the 4th page in on the information that you've been given. So you might like to have a look at that and make sure that you have that sort of along the way. All through reading this book, this will probably be really interesting information for you to be thinking about. So I'll pop that one away now. Let's get started on reading. The only other thing you need to know is that there we go. These pages is about 4 pages that all relate to chapters 1 to 3, and that's what we're going to be reading, chapters 1 to 3. So you'll have about 4 pages there that you're going to be looking at and thinking about as we go along. So it might be a really good idea each week before you do the reading to sit down and have a bit of a look at these pages, have a little bit of a read through and a chat about them, and see. That's going to make you really wonder what's going to be happening in the story, give you a bit of a clue about where we're going, and also then when you hear the answers to questions, you'll have that page right in front of you. So that might be really helpful for you. Okay. And here I am ready. I've got my Kindle device. This is my Kindle. I keep it in this little container here, and it's wonderful because I can go and buy a book online, and it's a bit cheaper than getting it physically, and it also means just by taking this one little device around with me, you can see chapter 1 there, I can take books with me everywhere I go. As you can see, let me go back to a front cover on this one. No, not going back there. Okay, so as you can see, there we are. That's what I read the other day, Treasures of the Snow, a note from the author. And today we're going to start on chapter 1. Okay, let's get going. Chapter 1. It was Christmas Eve, and 3 figures were climbing the steep white mountainside, the moonlight casting shadows behind them across the snow. The middle one was a woman in long petticoats and a dark cloak over her shoulders. Clinging to her hand was a black-haired boy of 6 who talked all the time with his mouth full. Walking apart with her eyes turned to the stars was a little girl of 7. Her hands were folded across her chest, and close against her heart she carried a golden gingerbread bear with eyes of white icing. The little boy also had a gingerbread bear, but he had eaten it all except to the back legs. He looked at the little girl spitefully. "Mine was bigger than yours," he announced. The girl seemed unconcerned. "I would not change," she replied calmly without turning her head, and then she looked down again with eyes full of love at the beautiful creature in her arms. How solid he looked, how delicious he smelt, and how brightly he gleamed in the starlight. She would never eat him. Never. 80 little village children had been given gingerbread bears, but hers had surely been by far the most beautiful. Yes, she would keep him forever in memory of tonight. Whenever she looked at him, she would remember Christmas Eve, the frosty blue sky, the warm glow of the lighted church, and the tree decked with silver stars, the carols, the crib, and the sweet, sad story of Christmas. It made her want to cry when she thought about the inn where there was no room. She would have opened her door wide and welcomed them in. Lucien, the boy, was annoyed by her silence. "I have nearly finished mine," he remarked, scowling. "Let me taste yours, Annette. You have not yet begun it." But Annette shook her head and held her bear a little closer. "I am never going to eat him," she replied. "I'm going to keep him forever and ever." They had come to a parting of the ways. The crumbly white path lined with the sleigh tracks divided. A little way along the right fork stood a group of chalets with lights shining in their windows and dark barns massed behind them. Annette was nearly home. Madame Morel hesitated. "Are you all right to run along home alone, Annette?" she asked doubtfully, "or should we take you to the door?" "Oh, I would much rather go alone," answered Annette, "and thank you for taking me. Good night, Madame. Good night, Lucien." She turned and fled in case Madame should change her mind and insist on seeing her to the door, when she so badly wanted to be alone. She wanted to get away from Lucienne's chatter and wrap herself round with the silence of the night. How could she think and look at the stars when she was having to make polite replies to Madame Morel and Lucienne? She had never been out alone at night before, and even this was a sort of accident. She was to have gone to church on the sleigh with father and mother. They had all been thinking about it and planning it for weeks. But that morning her mother had been taken ill and her father had gone off on the midday train to fetch the doctor from the town up the valley. The doctor had arrived about tea time, but he could not cure her in time to get up and go to church as Annette had hoped he would. So, to her great disappointment, she had to go instead with Madame Morel from the chalet up the hill. But when she had reached the church, it had been so beautiful that she had forgotten everything but the tree and the magic of Christmas. So it had not mattered so much after all. The magic stayed with her. And now, as she stood alone among snow and stars, it seemed a pity to go in just yet. She hesitated as she reached the steps leading up to the balcony and looked around. Just opposite loomed the cowshed. Annette could hear the animals moving and munching from the manger. A glorious idea struck her. She made up her mind in a moment, darted across the sleigh tracks and lifted the latch of the door. A warm smell of cattle and milk and hay greeted her as she slipped inside. She wriggled between the legs of the chestnut cow and wormed her way into the hay rack. The cow was having supper, but Annette flung her arms around her neck and let her go on munching. Surely the cows must have munched when Mary sat among them with her newborn baby in her arms, she thought to herself. She looked down at the manger and imagined baby Jesus lying in the straw. Through a hole in the roof she could see one bright star. She remembered how a star had shone over Bethlehem and guided the wise men to the house where Jesus was. She could imagine them padding up the valley on their lurching camels. And surely any moment now the door would open softly and the shepherds would come stealing in with little lambs in their arms. Perhaps they would offer to cover the child with woolly fleeces. As she leaned further over, a great wave of pity swept over her for the homeless baby against whom all doors had been shut. There would have been plenty of room in our chalet, she whispered, and yet perhaps after all this is the nicest place. The hay is sweet and clean, and Paquerette's breath is warm and pleasant. Maybe God chose the best cradle for this baby after all. She might have stayed there dreaming all night had it not been for the gleam of a lantern through the half-open door of the shed and the sound of firm, crunchy footsteps in the snow. And then she heard her father call her in a hurried, anxious voice. She slipped down from the rack, dodged Paquerette's tail, and ran out to him with wide-open arms. "I went in to wish the cows a happy Christmas," she said, laughing. "Did you come out to find me?" "Yes, I did," he replied. But he was not laughing. His face was pale and grave in the moonlight. He took her hand and almost dragged her up the steps. "You should have come in at once when your mother is so ill. She has been asking for you for the last half hour." Annette felt terrible about that. Somehow the Christmas tree had driven everything else out of her mind. And all the time her mother, whom she loved so much, was lying ill and wanting her. Annette had thought the doctor would have made her well. She took her hand from her father's and ran up the wooden steps. She slipped into her mother's bedroom. Neither the doctor nor the village nurse saw her until she had crept up to the bed, for she was a small, slim child who moved noiselessly as a shadow. But her mother saw her and half held out her arms. Annette, without a word, ran into them and hid her face on her mother's shoulder. She began to cry quietly, for her mother's face was almost as white as a pillow, and it frightened her. Besides, she felt sorry for having been away so long. "Annette," whispered her mother, "stop crying. I have a present for you." Annette stopped at once. A present? Of course. It was Christmas. She had quite forgotten. Her mother always gave her a present, but she usually had it on New Year's Day. Wherever could it be? She looked around expectantly. Her mother turned to the nurse. "Give him to her," she whispered. and the nurse drew back the blanket and produced a bundle wrapped in a white shawl. She came round to Annette and held it out to her. "Your little brother," the nurse explained. "Let us go down by the fire and you shall rock his cradle. We must leave your mother to sleep. Kiss her good night." "Your little brother," echoed her mother's weak voice. "He is yours, Annette. Bring him up and love him and look after him for me. I give him to you." Her voice trailed away and she closed her eyes. Annette, too dazed to speak, allowed herself to be led downstairs by the nurse. She sat down on a stool by the stove to rock the wooden cradle where her Christmas present lay smothered in shawls and blankets. She sat very still for a long time, staring at her little brother. The snow cast a strange light on the walls, and the glow of the stove burned rosy on the ceiling. The house was very, very still, and the Christmas star shone in through the unshuttered windows. Annette remembered that a star had once shone on the other Christmas baby in Bethlehem, and she thought that Mary must have sat and watched God's little son just as she, Annette, was sitting by the stove watching her little brother. She gently touched the top of his downy head, which was all she could see of him. Then with a tired sigh, she leaned her head against the cradle and let her imagination roam where it would. Stars, shepherds, little new babies, shut doors, wise men and gingerbread bears, they all became muddled up in her mind, and she slid gradually onto the floor. It was here that her father found her a half an hour later, lying as peacefully as her baby brother, her bright head pillowed on the cradle rocker. Poor little motherless creatures, he said as he stood to pick her up. How shall I ever bring them up without her? For Annette's mother had gone to spend Christmas with the angels. Chapter 2. That was how Daniel Vernier, aged 3 hours, became the special property of Annette Vernier, aged 7 years. The kind village nurse stayed for some time to bath and feed him, and when she left, Annette's father paid a woman from the village to come and nurse him, but he belonged to Annette, and nobody ever spoke of him as anything but Annette's baby. For once, the first great shock of her grief was over, Annette gathered up all of the love of her sorrowful, lonely little heart and poured it on her little brother. She held his bottle while he sucked and sat quietly by his cradle in case he should wake and want her. It was Annette who ran to him in the night if he woke or whimpered. It was she who carried him out on the balcony at midday so that the sun might shine on him, and in this atmosphere of love and sunshine the baby thrived. There was no other baby of his age in the valley to touch him for strength and beauty. He slept and woke and chuckled and fed and kicked and slept again. In fact, he never gave a moment's anxiety to anyone. "He was born under a lucky star," exclaimed the woman from the village, gazing at him thoughtfully. "He was born under a Christmas star," said Annette solemnly. "I think he will always be good and happy." And how he grew! By the time the sun was beginning to melt the snows and the crocuses were pushing up in the pale fields, he was easily outgrowing his baby clothes. And as soon as the cows had gone up the mountain, he cut his first tooth. As Annette knew nothing about first teeth and expected no trouble, it seemed the baby himself forgot that it should have been a troublesome affair. So instead of fretting and crying, he merely giggled and sucked his fists. By the time the beech leaves were flaming like golden torches among the dark pines and the first blizzards began to blow over the mountains, Denny was moving around and his cradle could contain him no longer. He wanted to explore everything from the stove to the balcony steps. Annette spent an anxious few weeks hauling him out of danger. In the end, she decided she could bear the strain no longer, so they tied him up by one pink foot to the leg of the kitchen table and he explored in circles, and life became more peaceful. One evening, Annette, slipping down to the living room after tucking Danny up in his cradle, found her father sitting by the stove with his head in his hands. He looked old and tired and grey. He had often looked old and tired since his wife died. But tonight he looked worse than usual. Annette, who tried hard to make up for her mother, laid her soft cheek against his bony one. "What is the matter, Papa?" she asked. "Are you very tired tonight? Shall I heat you up a cup of coffee?" He looked down at her curiously for a minute or two. She was so small and light, like some golden-haired fairy, but how sensible and womanly she was. Somehow during the past year he had made a habit of telling her his troubles. He had even listened to her serious advice. So now he drew her head against his shoulder and told her all about it. "We shall have to sell some of the cows, little daughter," he explained sadly. "We must have some more money or there will be no winter boots for you." Annette raised her head and stared at him in horror. They had only 10 cows and each one was a personal friend. Any one of them would be missed terribly. She must think of a better way to earn money than that. "You see," went on her father, "other men have wives to look after their little ones. I have to pay a woman to nurse Danny, and it doesn't come cheap. Yet someone must look after him, poor little boy." Now Annette sat up very straight and tossed back her plaits. She saw her way quite clearly. All she had to do was make her father see it too. "Papa," she said very slowly, "you do not need Mademoiselle Mortier any longer. I am 8.5 now, and I can look after Danny as well as anyone. You will not have to pay me anything, and then we can keep the cows. Why, think, Papa, how unhappy they would be to leave us. I do believe Paquerette would cry." "But you must go to school," said Father rather doubtfully. It would not be right to keep you at home. Anyhow, it is against the law. The master would want to know why, and he would tell the mayor, and we should get into trouble." "But it is much more important to look after Danny," answered Annette, wrinkling her forehead. "And if you explain to the master, he would understand. He is kind, the master, and he is a friend of yours. And let us try it and see what happens. I will do my lessons here in the kitchen, Papa, every morning, and Danny can play on the floor, and in any case, when he is 5, he will go to the infant school." Her father continued to look at her thoughtfully. Small as she was, he thought she was as clever as any woman in looking after the baby. Also, he knew she was marvellously handy about the house, but she could not do the cooking or knit the stockings or do the rough, heavy work. Besides, she ought to have some schooling. He sat thinking in silence for a full 5 minutes. And then he had an idea. "I wonder if your grandmother would come," he said suddenly. She is old and she has rheumatics. Her sight is poor, but she could do the cooking and mending perhaps, and she could help you with your lessons in the evenings. It could be company for you too when I'm up the mountain. You're too little a girl to be left alone all day long. If I write a letter to the master telling him that grandmother will give you a bit of teaching, maybe he will agree to keep quiet about it." Annette fetched 2 sheets of paper and the pen and ink from the cupboard. "Write to them both now," she said, "and I will post the letters when I go for the bread, and then we shall get the answers nice and quickly." Both letters were answered that week. The first answer was in the shape of grandmother. She arrived by train, all bent over, with a wooden box roped up very securely. Annette went down to meet her and watched the little electric train caterpilling its way up the valley between the hay fields. It was late. The man at the wheel explained angrily, because a cow had strayed onto the line and the train had had to stop. He was so eager to move on quickly that grandmother barely had time to get down from the train before it set off again. Her wooden box had to be hauled out after her while the train was moving. Grandmother, however, seemed quite unmoved. She leaned on her stick and wanted to know how she was to get up the hill. Annette, who knew nothing about rheumatism, suggested that they should walk. Grandmother said, "Nonsense, child." In the end, they got a lift in an empty farm cart that had brought cheeses down to the train and was now going back up the mountain. The road was stony, the wheels wooden, and the mule stumbled a lot. Annette enjoyed the ride very much more than grandmother did, but the old woman gritted her teeth and made no complaint. She only let out a tired sigh of relief when she found herself safely on the sofa by the stove. She had a cushion at her aching back, and Annette bustled about, getting her some tea. Denny came out from under the table, shuffling along on his backside. He stuck 3 fingers in his mouth and laughed at grandmother. She put on her spectacles to see him better. They sat for some moments, staring at each other. Her dim old eyes meeting his forget-me-not blue ones. Then he threw back his head and laughed. "That child will wear out his trouser seat," said grandmother, taking a piece of bread and butter and cherry jam. "He should be taught to crawl." She said no more until she finished her tea. Then she flicked the crumbs from her black skirt and rose, leaning heavily on her stick. "So," she remarked, "I have come. What I can, I will do. What I cannot, you must do for me. Now, Annette, turn that baby the right way up and come and show me round the kitchen." From that moment, grandmother did what she could, and Annette did the rest, and the household ran like clockwork, all except for Denny, who continued to move around and around the table leg on his seat in spite of grandmother. So after a few days, Annette was sent to the village to buy some thick black felt, and grandmother sewed round patches onto the seats of all Denny's knickerbockers. He looked a little odd in them, but they served their purpose very well indeed. After all, they weren't seen much because they were nearly always underneath him. The second answer arrived in the shape of the village schoolmaster. He came up from the valley late on Saturday afternoon to call on Monsieur Bernier. Annette's father was milking cows and saw him coming out of the cowshed window. He did not want to argue with the schoolmaster because he was afraid of getting the worst of it. So he ran out the back door and hid in the hayloft. Annette, who was also looking out of the living room window, saw her father's legs disappear up the ladder just as the schoolmaster came round the corner. She understood perfectly what was expected of her. She opened the door and invited the master in, offering him most politely the best chair with a red plush seat. He was very fond of Annette, and Annette was very fond of him, but today they were a little bit shy of each other. Grandmother folded her hands and sat up straight. Her expression reminded Annette of a picture she had seen in an old war horse scenting battle. "Annette, I have come to see your father," began the schoolmaster, coughing nervously, "to discuss his letter about your being absent from school. I cannot say I think it right for a little girl of your age. Besides, it is against the law of the state." "The state will know nothing about Annette unless you choose to mention her," said grandmother shortly. "Besides, I will educate the child myself. I do not think it right for a little boy of Daniel's age to be left without his sister to look after him." "But can't you look after him?" suggested the schoolmaster gently. "Certainly not," snapped grandmother. "My sight is so poor that I cannot see where he is going. My arms are so rheumaticky that I cannot pick him up if he falls. Besides, he moves like an express train, and I am nearly 80. "You do not know what you are talking about," said Grandmother. The schoolmaster gazed at Danny, who was playing on the floor. There was nothing much to be seen of him but the black felt patch and his dimpled legs. The schoolmaster frowned. "When will your father be in, Annette?" "Oh, I do not know. He may not be back for some time. It is not worth your while to wait, monsieur," replied Annette steadily. She knew perfectly well that her father would return just as soon as the master's hat disappeared down the valley. The schoolmaster sat thinking. He was a good man and really cared about Annette and his duty towards her, yet he did not want to give up her father, his old friend, into the hands of the law. He could see that the child was needed at home, and at last he had an idea. He did not think it was a very good one, but it was better than nothing. He turned to Grandmother. "I will let the matter rest," he said, "on one condition only." Wonder what his condition is. "That is, that every Saturday morning when Annette comes down for the bread, she shall visit me in my house. I will give her some tests to see if she is making progress in her studies at home. I will say no more, but if I find that she is learning nothing, then I shall feel it my duty to insist that she attend school like other children." He tried to speak sternly, but Annette beamed at him. Danny, sensing a family victory, suddenly turned himself the right way up and laughed. The schoolmaster looked at the two fair, motherless children for a moment, smiled, and took his leave. As soon as he had disappeared into the pine wood, Annette ran to the door, called to her father to come down from the hayloft. So every Saturday morning, Annette rapped at the front door of the tall white house where the schoolmaster lived, with her bread basket on her back and her tattered exercise book in her hand. In the winter, they sat by the stove and ate spiced fruit tart made by the schoolmaster's friendly housekeeper and drank hot chocolate. In the summer, they sat on the veranda and ate cherries and drank apple juice. And after that, the tests would begin. They always started with arithmetic, but Annette was no good at arithmetic and struggled with her answers. After a few minutes, they would go on to history. The schoolmaster did not have to set test questions for this subject, for Annette loved history. She would lean forward, clasping her knees, and talk about how William Tell had won the freedom of Switzerland. She would tell the story of how his brave little son had stood still while an apple had been placed upon his head and was split by his father's whizzing arrow. She would tell of the brave prisoners of the lakeside castle of Chillon, who paced his cell until the very paving stones were worn out by his footsteps. She would tell of the division of Switzerland into regions called cantons. And then she would tell how the beautiful Luce had gone out to drive her cows to pasture and had been carried off by the lord of the Gruyere castle. She had pined away in her stone prison, yearning for the forests and for the fields and the alpine slopes, and had died of a broken heart. Oh my goodness, it's always sad when they say a broken heart. Annette's voice almost shook when she spoke of that beautiful captive. Then they would go over the stories of the Waldensian martyrs who were persecuted for their religion and who went to their death singing praises. Their bodies were hurled over the precipices, but their faith and love lived on and their spirits went happily to God. Annette and the schoolmaster would look at each other with shining eyes, for they both loved courage. And after this, they would turn to the Bible, which Annette was beginning to know quite well, for she read it aloud to Grandmother every evening. By this time, the schoolmaster would have forgotten to tell Annette off because she wasn't very good at arithmetic, and instead he would give her fresh books to read, and the housekeeper would fill the gaps in her bread basket with spiced gingerbread hearts and knobbly chocolate sticks wrapped in silver paper. Then Annette would say goodbye. The schoolmaster and his housekeeper would stand at the door and watch her until she reached the edge of the pine wood, and here she always turned round to wave. "What a dear little girl," the housekeeper would say. "Yes," the schoolmaster would reply with a sigh, "if only she would learn her arithmetic." Chapter 3. It was Christmas Eve again, 5 years after the beginning of this story. Denny was therefore 5 years old. It was a great day. For the first time in his life, he had been considered old enough to go down to the church with Annette to see the tree. Now he sat up in bed eating a bowl of potato soup. His yellow head only just showed above his enormous white feather duvet, which was almost as fat as it was broad. Annette sat beside him, and in her hand she held a shining gingerbread bear. "I am sorry, Denny," she announced firmly, "but you cannot have the bear in bed with you. It will be all crumbs by the morning. Look, I will put him up here on the cupboard. The moon will shine in on him and you will be able to see him." Denny opened his mouth to argue, but changed his mind and filled his mouth with potato soup. It was unreasonable of his sister to object to his hugging his gingerbread bear all night. But after all, there were lots of other things to be happy about, and Denny was always happy, from the moment when he opened his eyes in the morning to the moment he closed them at night. Tonight he was especially happy because he had heard the bells and seen the glittering tree and had been out in the snow by starlight. He handed his empty bowl to Annette and cuddled down under his feather duvet. "Do you think," he asked, "what Father Christmas would come? Do you think," he asked, "that Father Christmas would come if I put my slippers on the windowsill?" Annette was rather startled. She wondered where he had heard of such a thing. In Switzerland at that time, Father Christmas was not such a well-known person as in other countries. Swiss children had their Christmas bear from the tree on Christmas Eve and presents from their family on New Year's Day. On Christmas Day they went to church and they had a feast, but few children got a present. "I heard," went on Denny, "that he came on a sleigh drawn by reindeer and left presents in good children's slippers. Am I a good child, Annette?" "Yes," answered Annette, kissing him. "You are a very good child, but you will not get a present from Father Christmas. He only goes to rich little boys." "Aren't I a rich little boy?" asked Denny, who thought he had everything that he wanted in life. "No, Denny," replied Annette firmly, "you are not rich. We are poor, and Papa has to work hard. Grandma and I have to go on and on patching your clothes because we cannot afford to buy new ones." Denny chuckled. "I don't mind being poor. I like it. Now tell me a story, Annette. Tell me about Christmas and the little baby and the cows and the great big shining star." So Annette told the story, and Denny, who should have been asleep, listened wide-eyed. "I should have liked sleeping in the hay better than in the inn," he said when she had finished. "I should like to sleep with Paquerette. I think it would be fun." Annette shook her head. No, you would not like it at all," she replied. "Not in the winter, without a duvet. You would be very cold and unhappy, and you would long for a warm bed." It was cruel of them to say there was no room for a little new baby. They could have made room somehow. The cuckoo clock on the stairs struck 9. Annette jumped up. "You must go to sleep, Denny," she said, "and I must make Papa his hot chocolate." She kissed her brother, tucked him up, put out the light and left him. But Denny did not go to sleep. Instead, he lay staring out into the darkness, thinking hard. He was not a greedy little boy, but he could not help thinking that if Father Christmas happened to come to their house, would be a great pity not to be ready. Of course, it was unlikely he would come since Denny was only a poor child, but on the other hand, it was just possible that he might. And so, after all, it could do no harm to put out the little slipper, even if there was nothing in it in the morning. The question was where to put it. He could not put it on the windowsill because he could not open the high barred shutters by himself. Nor could he put it outside the front door because the family were all sitting in the living room. The only place was just inside the back door on the little strip of snow that divided the kitchen from the hay barn. Of course, Father Christmas was unlikely to see it there, but still there was no harm in trying. Denny's mind was made up. He crept out of bed, and tiptoed cautiously across the bedroom and down the stairs. He went barefoot because he didn't want anyone to hear him. In his hand he carried one small scarlet fur-lined slipper. Annette had made it, and Danny felt that it might catch the eye of Father Christmas. It was a struggle to lift the great wooden bar that latched the kitchen door, and Danny had to stand on a stool so that he could manage it. He had a moment's bright vision of snow and starlight, and then the bitter air struck him and almost took his breath away. He thrust the slipper onto the step and shut the door again as quickly as he could. Back to bed scuttled Danny with a light heart. He cuddled down under the bedclothes, curled himself into a ball and buried his nose in the pillows. He had already said his proper prayers with Annette before he got into bed, but now he had a little bit to add. Please, dear God, he whispered, make Father Christmas and his reindeer come this way, and make him see my scarlet slipper. Make him put a little present inside, even if I am only a poor little boy. And then Danny rolled over sideways and he fell asleep to dream, like thousands of other children the world over, of the old gentleman in the red cloak careering across the snow to the jangle of reindeer bells. He woke very early, and of course the first thing he thought of was the scarlet slipper. It was such an exciting thought that his heart started to thump. He peeped over the top of his duvet to see whether Annette was awake. But Annette was fast asleep, with her long fair hair spread all over the pillow. For all Danny knew, it might have been the middle of the night. In fact, he had almost decided it must still be the middle of the night when he heard his father clattering the milk churns in the kitchen below. So it must be Christmas morning. Danny must get down quickly, or his father would open the door and find his present before he did. Somehow, Danny was absolutely sure that there would be a present. All his doubts of the night before had vanished in his sleep. He crept out of the room without waking Annette. He slipped into the kitchen where his father was scolding the churns. His father did not see him until he felt two arms clasping his legs and looking down. There was his son, rosy, bright-eyed and tousled, looking up at him. "Has Father Christmas been?" asked Danny. Surely his father, who stayed up so late and got up so early, must have heard the bells and the crunch of hooves in the snow. "Father Christmas," repeated his father in bewilderment. And then he smiled. "Why, no, he didn't come here. We live too far up the mountain for him." But Danny shook his head. "We don't," he said eagerly. "His reindeers can go anywhere, and I expect you were asleep and you didn't hear him. Open the door for me, Papa, just in case he left me a present." His father wished he had known of this earlier so he could have put a chocolate stick on the step, for he hated to see the boy disappointed. However, open the back door he must to roll the churns across to the stable. So he lifted the latch, and in an instant Danny had dived between his legs like an eager rabbit and was kneeling by his slipper in the snow. Then he gave a wild, high-pitched scream of excitement and dived back again into the kitchen with his slipper in his arms. A miracle had happened. Father Christmas had been and had left a present. In all his happy 5 years of life, Danny had never had such a perfect present before, for curled up in the furry lining of his scarlet slipper was a tiny white kitten with blue eyes and one black smudge on her nose. It was a weak, thin little kitten, very nearly dead with cold and hunger. Had it not been the full warmth of the fur lining, it would certainly have been quite dead, but it still breathed lightly. Danny's father, forgetting all about the churns, knelt down on the kitchen floor beside his son and set about helping the kitten. First, he wrapped it in a piece of hot flannel and laid it against the hot wall of the stove. Then he heated milk in a pan and fed it with a spoon, as it was far too weak to suck. At first it only splattered and dribbled, but after a while it put out a tiny pink tongue and its dim blue eyes grew bright and interested. Then after about 5 minutes or so, it twitched its tail and stretched itself. Finally, having had quite enough to eat, it curled itself back up into a ball and set up a faint, contented purr. All this time, Danny and his father had not spoken one word because they were so busy helping the kitten. But now that their work was successfully finished for the time being, they sat back and looked at each other. Danny's cheeks were the colour of poppies and his eyes shone like stars. "I knew he would come," he whispered, "but I never guessed he would bring such a beautiful present. It's the most beautiful present that I have ever had in all my life. What shall I call it, Papa?" "Oh, you had better call it Klotz, after the Christmas saint," said Papa, and he looked curiously at Danny with a sort of new respect. It certainly seemed like a miracle. He left the sleeping kitten in Danny's care and went to the stables. Sitting in the dim light with his head pressed against the flanks of the cows and the milk frothing into the pails, he tried to think of some explanation. Of course the kitten had strayed across from the barn, but it did seem wonderful that it should have found Danny's slipper and been there all ready for him. And after a while, Danny's father decided that perhaps it was not so wonderful after all. Surely it was natural on Christmas Eve that the Father in heaven, thinking of his own son, would not have wanted to disappoint a motherless child on earth. Surely he had guided the steps of the white kitten for the sake of Jesus, the baby born in Bethlehem. Danny's father paused for a moment in his milking and thanked God on behalf of his little son. Annette appeared in the kitchen shortly afterwards to get breakfast. She stood still in amazement at the sight of Danny in his nightshirt and overcoat watching over a white kitten. She was about to ask questions when Danny put his finger on his lip and said, then he tiptoed over to her, pulled her down on a chair, climbed onto her knee and whispered the whole strange story into her ear. Annette had no difficulty in explaining it to herself. She believed that such a pure white kitten must have dropped straight from heaven. She sat down on the floor and gathered Danny and the kitten onto her lap, and here grandmother found them half an hour later when she came in expecting to find her Christmas coffee steaming on the table. And that's the end of chapter 3. I hope you've really enjoyed it. I think this is going to be a really fun and enjoyable experience reading this book together. So remember to have a look at your exercises for chapters 1 to 3. You can come back and listen again. You know, if you have a bit of a go at answering those, have a try. And then once you've had a try at answering those questions, the ones that you can't answer, try listening again, and maybe then they'll be a lot easier for you. Okay, love to see you soon to read chapters 4 to 6. Bye-bye.